And it's with great pleasure and gratitude that I introduce you to Amanda Kraft. Amanda is the manager of advocacy in the Office of Immigration Issues of the Presbyterian Church USA. She helps mobilize church entities and Presbyterian-related organizations to affirm and promote the civil and human rights of immigrants, migrants, and refugees. She trains leaders in immigration advocacy policy efforts in their context. She engages and is guided by immigrant-led organizations and interfaith coalitions. She's lived and served in Central America and along the U.S.-Mexico border. And she currently lives with her husband and two sons in Kentucky. And she's completing a Doctor of Ministry program at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. I just ask for all of us to bow our heads for a moment in prayer. Dear God, our rock in difficult times, you have always been steadfast and lived with us and in us and taught us to love each other. As we enter a difficult month, but one that ends in Thanksgiving and celebration, we thank you for being with us and leading us today. Amen. Amen. So, Amanda, I'll turn this over to you.
Thank you, Carol. And thank you for the invitation to be with you all this morning. It is a joy, and I love that you all do this in a hybrid fashion. It makes it possible for me to be in many places when I can do this. So I really appreciate that as well. And it is interesting. I want to take some time to just walk through a few slides to talk a little bit about sort of where the church has been, the Presbyterian Church USA has been, but I hope we can have more of a conversation about this issue. I think it's a controversial issue because of the period we're in. And migration is something that is a human experience. It's something humans share across generations and across time periods, but it's one where we're in a period where nation states makes it a bit more challenging to talk about. And the period that we're in the United States, we're going through some changes, and we're going through changes of who's arriving and how they're arriving. And so that too also makes some things unsettled. And so I really just want to take some time to think about how we as people of faith think about migration and the people who are in those journeys, and how we respond with a place of openness, a place of being willing to see someone beyond immigration status. And I think that's the real difference between what our country says in the area of politics and what our church says in the area of faith. And what are we called into, and how do we live into those spaces when they might be in tension with one another? And how do we sort of listen to where God is being revealed in that? So I actually want to start with a scripture passage, and I'm reading from Hebrews 11. I'm reading from chapter 11, Hebrews 8. Let's see here. Reading verses 8 through, I'm going to toss in about 15. We won't read all the verses. But this is a part of Hebrews where they're talking about what does faith look like in sort of early church communities? What does faith look like as the early church is also going through lots of changes in their period of time. And they're trying to figure out what does faith look like? And for the early church, going back to the stories that they hold dearly, the threads of ancestors, right, of people of faith that they hold dearly in their communities of faith. What does that look like? And what does it look like for a group of people who are now engaging? So you have people who come from the Jewish faith who believe that they're the chosen, right? but they're also welcoming in Gentiles. So we have this shift that's happening within the church. And so I find some of these early books who talk to the early church community to be helpful in where we are right now in the United States. So I'm going to read from there. And this is the faith of Abraham. So there are a few that are noted in this part of Hebrews. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he set out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he stayed for a time in the land he had been promised, as in the foreign land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked forward to a city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Now he and others died in faith without having received the promises. But from a distance, they saw and greeted them. They could imagine this was coming, right? They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth. For people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of a land that they had left behind, they would have an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better homeland. They desire a heavenly one. So I just want to sort of lay that out there, right? We come from this story of people who traveled, right? Of ancestors who moved to different lands where there are already people inhabiting those lands. We come from a history of a church that moved around the globe. And so for us to sort of think about, nation state is a rather new concept for the world. And so how do we think about ourselves sort of beyond these ways in which we separate ourselves, knowing that we have laws for reasons, right? We want people to be able to migrate in safe ways. We want a nation state to have sovereign borders. We want to respect all of those laws. So I'm not advocating that we're moving beyond that. The Presbyterian Church doesn't believe that. But what are we as people of faith in communities meant to do when we encounter people who may not be from the United States originally? What are we called? How are we called to respond? How are we asked to be present with them? And I think you all have some experience with that. So I'm going to share a few slides, and then I hope we can talk a bit about some of the experiences you all are seeing. And then as we're in this moment of political maneuvering where the story of migration gets told in very particular lenses, which I think limits our ability to imagine. So I'm just going to share a few slides. See if it comes up. Do you all see those?
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. So for the Presbyterian Church, we have a long history of talking about people on the move. And how do we respond to people on the move? And so there has been a lot of work done on thinking about how we provide welcome in our places of worship, in our communities where we reside, knowing that people are moving all the time around the world. But what does it mean for us when we receive someone in our communities? And the Presbyterian Church has lots of policy, social witness policy on all of the groups that I've named there: immigrant, migrant, and refugees. And really what's fascinating, I need to be on this to actually click. Here we go. There's my contact information if anyone wants to reach out. And Carol also has it. So if anyone would like to reach out to me to have further conversation, I would love it. But we know that the past shapes the present. And so who are we as a people of faith, sort of within this denominational structure? How have Presbyterians sort of looked at and understood themselves in the role of welcoming newcomers in their communities? And the Presbyterian Church actually got engaged in their first advocacy focus. So mission was happening while the church was here, but they first start to get into looking at the way the country receives newcomers, around the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed in 1882. The Presbyterian, both of the streams of the Presbyterian Church at that time make two different statements, in encouraging the national denomination to question the exclusion of newcomers. And this came from a place of providing mission and ministry to Chinese workers who were in the United States. And we still have a church that is many generations out that still exists in Louisiana that's tied to this ministry. And so it's a very fascinating way, right? We were in the midst of, and we were part of, and the community was coming together, and we spoke from that place of great care. And so what does it mean when you start to exclude and expel people? And this is our first foray into the advocacy world around immigration. And the US had been making immigration statements for a long time. The US, some of their first things that they pass are about who is a citizen in the United States. And that's given a lot of our history. So you all started talking about the Civil War. That has a lot to do with it. So there's a lot of history around how immigration defined who was welcome, and who had rights in this country. But this is the first time that we get involved, particularly as the Presbyterian stream of things. And then we have our most recent statement, which is about becoming a sanctuary and accompaniment church. And the Presbyterian Church USA was one of the key drivers of the sanctuary movement in the 1980s. It really becomes a movement out of work that was happening in Arizona. And as Central Americans were crossing the southern border, so they were crossing into Mexico, then they were crossing into the United States to seek safety from armed conflict that was happening across that region, and economic downfall in Mexico. So there was lots of movement happening in the 70s and 80s in that northern part of Latin America. So Central Americans were trying to find safety coming to the US-Mexico border, and the US wouldn't declare them refugees. And there's a very political reason, but part of it is because the US was involved in those armed conflicts. They had a very strong interest in which governments would maintain power in lots of those countries due to our economic interactions and our political interactions, their closeness to the United States. So they wouldn't declare these folks refugees. And so what churches figured out is they saw these people traveling, that it was the church who was supposed to respond. So it was a Mennonite and one of our PCUSA pastors, John Fife, who got first involved. And then the movement stretched across the United States because Canada was offering safety and permanency. So what most churches did in the United States was work as a sort of transportation train. Folks sometimes link it to the Underground Railroad, although it was somewhat different. It was a different time, but really moving people from the southern border of the United States to get them to Canada. It was a really important movement for the Presbyterian Church. There was a lot of involvement, clandestine involvement from the US government infiltrating that work. So it's a very important history for PCUSA. And that sanctuary sort of is now part of our DNA. And so lots of congregations work in coalitions that provide that kind of welcome, hospitality, and protection. And the accompaniment piece really comes from our deep connection to refugee resettlement. The refugee resettlement work sort of gets highlighted around movements of people in World War II. So the vast migration that happens around armed conflict in Europe, and the vast migration of Jewish peoples is what gets really highlighted in our response, the US's lack of response to folks who are on the move. And Presbyterians step into that void. And it's really Presbyterian women who step in to start receiving and sponsoring folks who are leaving, trying to get into the United States. And that becomes an important, again, change in our DNA as we then start to welcome refugees, becoming sponsors and also providing that longer term care as people settle in a new place. And that accompaniment piece has extended. And so a lot of the work now that happens with refugees or with asylum seekers, that comes from that history. And in fact, Presbyterian disaster assistance, one of their main mandates, comes from refugee resettlement. So it's an important piece looking at how disaster and crisis causes migration. Beyond that piece, I think what is happening in the world today too, as migration becomes larger, right? People can travel more. We can get to places much more easily. Migration is happening in very different ways today. And I'm not sure that as political thinkers, we've been able to respond to that creatively. But as we think about that, right, as people can move and seek safety, we talk about Abraham finding this land that he doesn't know. What does it mean when people are involved in a world where that push and pull, right? Where you're being forced out or you're being pulled somewhere. What do we do with those? How do we have those conversations when people are forced to migrate, or maybe they're pulled because families now live all over the world? So what does that look like? And what does it look like as the United States, where we cause some of that all to happen, right? We're pulling folks for labor, right? We do that a lot in the US. And then we're also pushing if we're not thinking about how foreign policy always plays out. So it's a very interesting context to be in. And we hold both of those in tension, right? There's the sanctuary piece, there's the accompaniment piece, and there's also understanding our country as a sovereign nation and really wanting people to have the ability to migrate in safe ways that protect their human rights as they do that, but also respects us, the citizens who are residing in a country, people who are residing in the country, that they come in ways where they can be welcomed, maintained, and sustained in really healthy ways. So thinking about the health of the community. So what does it mean to be the accompaniment church? And we as national staff, we sort of watch these trends that are happening. And we are in a moment where our demographics are changing. And we're in a space where politically we're very polarized. So what does it mean when we're faced with change that's happening very quickly and we can't quite grasp everything that's happening? And you all mentioned the media, right? So the media is playing into some of this, but we are at one of the highest rates of immigrants into the United States outside of what happened in the early migration from Europe. So we have about 14% of individuals who now reside in the United States who were born elsewhere. And that, although that may not sound very large, it's actually a large population for us in the United States, and they're coming from all over the world. So again, we're sort of we're in a space where things are happening, changes are happening, and how are we really able to sit in that space of some uncomfortableness, right? Some of that discomfort because change is happening quickly. And so what we're really trying to do as we think about these changes is how do we live into a space where we're not fed by the way media talks about it or some political leaders talk about it, but we're looking at each other with a real sense of humanity in each other. And we really want to get to know each other. For those of us who are in the advocacy world, feel like that's really key to be doing the advocacy piece. Ultimately, we spend a lot of time in the US talking about the power that the executive branch has around immigration, and they have some, and they can make some decisions that really affect people who are on temporary statuses. But it's really Congress who sets immigration laws and statutes. And Congress is in a really hard place, right? They're not really passing much of anything with great substance. And so we know that this work is really a long-term work. So to get into that kind of advocacy space where you often feel like you're not even talking on the same parallel, right? Like you see the world so differently. Your point of view and your experience is so different than maybe the political official that you're talking to. You have to have this other way that's sustaining you. Sort of thinking about Abraham on the move. How are we in relationship with newcomers? And that local context is so important. and so necessary to understand what's going on in the community and to be able to make the response that makes sense to your community. And it's at that local and sometimes state level that can make a huge difference for sort of the immediate needs of those who are residing in our spaces, who are making new home in these places, when our federal government is a bit unpredictable in what will be decided, and oftentimes nothing's decided. So again, immigration is a very controversial issue that political leaders at the federal level will use, but there's very little movement happening either way. And I will say, administrations can sway the rhetoric in some ways, and when Biden ran 4 years ago on his campaign, he really lifted up some ways that he wanted to provide some safety and protection for populations in the United States who have very little access to protections. And it took an act of Congress to change that, and Congress didn't do it. So again, it's really hard to understand. There were times where the Biden administration tried to implement some new ways of receiving asylum seekers on the border that would alleviate some of that immediate suffering on the border. And then Texas sued them. So again, there is a lot that's happening at that federal level, but what happens in states is really important. What's happening and what the ability for us to respond to as sort of the political space is a little messy. It's murky right now. How do we not sort of get caught up in that? How do we become sort of that response of faith? And I really would want to stop here because I think you all have some experience with that local context, and where the national and the local intersect. And so I just want to sort of open it up for some conversation.
Great. So we welcome comments both remotely and from the room. So yes, we have Jack.
You know, one of the barriers for immigrants from Latin America is language. It's so difficult to help a family when they're not able to understand a word of English. Now, with time down and generations, that will disappear. But in the meantime, it seems to be a very formidable barrier.
Oh, that's such a great question. Language is such a great question, right? Because so we engage, right, in that language, and language becomes important as we try to understand one another. And when you're talking about Central America, right, that people are coming with lots of different languages, right? We often assume that it's only Spanish, but you have lots of indigenous folks who don't manage Spanish very well either. And so it can be this very challenging space to be in. But what I will say is that most of the world, so the vast majority of people now in the world, are multicultural. We are actually in the minority as a monocultural state. And so I think for us too, to sort of be able to think through, how do we provide spaces where people can learn language, especially if they have multiple languages coming in, that way in which their brain functions to be able to learn another language is already primed for English, right? And how do we as English hearers, because and I learned Spanish as an adult, so it's not easy to learn another language if I've only been focused on that hearing and comprehension, because I didn't have that muscle in my brain. It took a long time to work that muscle. But I think for us as English hearers, how do we take the time to really listen? How do we be patient in a space where we understand people are speaking a second, third, fourth language, and that we can also engage in ways that slows that interaction down? I think that's really such an important piece, right? And how do we sit together if our language doesn't? Are there ways that we can be together if we can't do these really deep conversations? And I think those ways of curiosity, of being present with one another, but the language learning is important. And churches for a long time have been really important partners in the language learning. So there are lots of examples around the country of churches being involved with English as another language of learning. And so it is important. It is important to provide those and that's a fun way of getting to know each other too. I must admit, like anytime I've done language cafes in Louisville's a very large resettlement city in Kentucky, and it's just fun. But yeah, I think that language is hard, right? And how do we come together in a place where we're patient with each other?
May I make a comment then too, please?
Well,
Yeah.
now, excuse me,
Oh.
John, just a minute.
Um,
Michael's had his hand up for a long time.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
So
Oh.
I'll recognize him first. Thank you. Michael?
Okay, am I muted? I guess I'm not. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, great. Thank you, Amanda. This is so beautiful to hear this. I know you wanted us to talk about what might be going on the local level, but I want to sort of take this in the other direction at sort of the global level. Nate Cohn had a piece today in the New York Times about the election. But one of the things that he mentioned in there is that the United States seems to be maybe the only or one of the few countries that is not going in a sort of global right-wing populist turnoff to Western style democracies. I say Western style because that includes Brazil and Japan. And so that really is sort of, I think, underlines how the important the church is in the face of this sort of intolerance toward the foreigner. And while you were speaking, I was thinking of an experience that may seem completely unrelated, but I promise I'll get there in a second. And that is, in 1921, the Ku Klux Klan rioted in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the famous Greenwood Massacre. And they completely destroyed the entire Black Wall Street area of Tulsa. One of the few people that stood against the Klan was Charles Kerr, who was the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church of Tulsa. And one of the things he did was to open the basement of the First Presbyterian Church, because it was close to Greenwood, and allowed people who were escaping the Klan's massacre to come there and take shelter. So I just wanted, again, sort of a global thing, but I just wanted to make note of that because the church's role in this is absolutely critical. And I'll mute myself now.
John, did you want to make a comment, John Gaffney?
Yes, thank you. I think various people find that it's, maybe this is sort of peripheral, but many people find it sort of bothersome that Spanish seems to be accorded a special situation. Spanish speaking people don't seem to have to learn English, but if you're from Vietnam or China or Russia or wherever you happen to come from, or Italy, you have to learn English. And I know from personal experience, having lived in Sweden for a year and having had a child born there, had a whole sort of life in a year. I worked for IBM there, but at that time, the only people that spoke any English, hard to believe, but anyway, were at IBM. So I really worked my two-show off to try to learn Swedish so I could get along. But anyway, that's sort of peripheral. But anyway, the business of I think Spanish speaking, Spanish seems to get special importance, if you will. And I think a lot of Spanish speaking people don't want to learn English. It takes work, I know, to learn a foreign language, having had to do so. But I remember I felt like I was mentally crippled if I couldn't speak. I remember our secretary getting me some places in the movies. You had to call up and reserve a place, and I wanted to learn how to do it, and I finally did, and I was so happy. Anyway, enough of me, but that's just some view. Thank you.
Amanda, do you want to comment on that? And then I know Brigitte has her hand raised. So
Sure. I actually am married to a gentleman from Guatemala, and his parents live in the US. And he speaks beautiful English. But I also know that his parents have come to this country with a 6th grade education. And so, and there is a community for them to be a part of, right? So it's not that they haven't endeavored to learn English, because they do, and they are able, what they'll say, defend themselves in English, but they also really appreciate that there's a place for them to be. And Spanish, of course, because part of the US was Spanish speaking for a long history. I think Spanish is a hard, and I would hope that all communities have a space where people can speak and feel free. I think we as a country are better off when we can have multiple languages going on. I think language learning is absolutely important. I have not been in any federal, like any official, any school, anything where people aren't having to learn. I haven't been in most workplaces. And we have also utilized, I also want to say this, when we look at the vast majority of lower skilled jobs, we are pulling people from a particular part of the world. And those jobs don't afford language learning. And so again, I think we have to be really aware of what's going on in our communities. I don't think it's a desire not to learn. I think there's a lot of obstacles to learning. So I don't want to, and again, some people are going to learn it and some aren't. Now I'm not, I lived with mission coworkers, some who could speak the language where they were and some who couldn't, right? So I think a lot of that is how do we be patient, and how do we sort of allow this world to operate around us? And how do we be curious enough to think, even this person who might be in the grocery line who's speaking another language to her children, what does that look like? And what I will say for my family is it's a real struggle to keep multiple languages going with generations after. So I am constantly reminded by my mother-in-law, who insists that we continue to speak Spanish to our children because English is so, and again, I think those are things that we come together and we talk about as community to really think through. But having space to learn a language, you have to have space and time. Not everyone is in a labor market where that space and time is valued to learn a language. So yeah, Bridget.
Brigitte, yeah, go ahead.
Well,
Go ahead.
English is my second language. And as most of you know, we've had this interfaith, intercongregational refugee support group for the past 8 years. And so we've learned a lot, and I think Amanda touched on a lot of points. Some people, the last family, or not the last family, but one of the last families we served, the mother was illiterate in Dari, as far as writing is concerned, the father barely. And so I think what you mentioned, kindness, patience, and we have to remind ourselves and our group, to suspend judgment, because it's easy, especially when you're frustrated and, you're trying to do something for the umpteenth time. It's just hard, and we haven't gone through these. Most of us have not gone through these particular experiences. It's not the same thing to go to France and not know French. So one of the ways to, obviously we needed to have translators and so on for that particular family. But one of the ways to share, two ways to share and to build some commonality were to share meals. That always works. And it's a hands-on, it's community building. And the other thing is, if the families have children, there is nothing like that brings generations and cultures together like children. And so anyway, that's my comment. just for the language part.
Yes.
Thank you for your comments, Amanda.
Thank you, Bridget. That is so
Yeah.
helpful, right? Is we want to, sometimes we lean into the differences, but what we really need to do is find those commonalities where we can start, right? That's so great. Thank you, Bridget.
Yeah. We have a question here in the room.
This is more, I guess, part of the challenge is the end game of where we're going to end up with this multicultural society, because there's just practicalities in terms of celebrating all these different holidays. For instance, I've moved 3 years ago from Ohio back to Maryland. And we've never had so many days off. The school experience is just constantly interrupted by all, so to me, it's like we almost need to agree that, on just a few set dates to celebrate everyone's holidays, so that we can have a cohesive experience in terms of school, just one example, but I, in my heart, I certainly want to be open to immigration, and that's certainly how my family came here. So my heart always lands there, but there's some realities in terms of, we do have to have some vision for a cohesive culture that brings everyone into some kind of uniformity. I don't know.
Golly, what great question. I mean, those are such deep questions, right? And I think, so much in the US, we have a long history, right, of figuring out how do we come together. We have some skills, I think, that could be helpful in that conversation, but we lean so much into equality in that conversation because there's so much going on right now, and not necessarily the equity, because the equity means we have to come together and make some decisions together. And how do we do that at table together? And I think that's so key. Right now, we're in a point where we're just trying to manage, right? But we haven't gotten to those deeper questions about how do we create a space that's reflective of those multiple values? How do we not lose values that we hold in this country that are really important, right? How do we make those decisions about how we come together in a more unified way? And I think that's where we are, right? We haven't quite figured that out yet. And so we're just throwing it all out there, right? But how do we have, and where do those places come together, right? Where do we come together to have those conversations about what we celebrate together? What we do together, what we hold is really important. And we're not quite there yet. We're not quite there yet, but I appreciate those questions because they're so key.
I do have a comment from the chat that says, in regards to learning English, the Jewish immigration experience was there was no going back to their country of origin. So they decided and sought out learning English, no matter the obstacle. Let Amanda comment, then maybe others of us will want to.
No, I think it's a great question, right? And we're in a moment in our world where movement could go back and forth, and your connection to your country of origin can be maintained in ways we haven't experienced before. So I have a recent migration history from Italy. So my grandmother was Italian and came. And although she went back a few times, right, her connection to her place of origin was not as consistent. Now they can FaceTime and they can hear music and, right, like all of that. There's even countries where they're learning to, they're voting in different parts of the world, right? So it's just, we are in a different period. And what does that mean, right? And how do we think about the way we invest in community where we reside? And how do we do that together? I think that's an excellent point. Thank you.
May I make a comment, Carol?
No, let's Don Picard has his hand. Well, we'll try to get everybody
Okay.
to have heard. Thanks. We'll get back to you.
Thank you.
Some of the things you were just saying about the way the world is changing causes me to ask you if your office and other places in the BC USA are thinking about how technology can help to overcome this language question. We've really gotten good at and having a Google translate all kinds of languages
Mhm.
back and forth. But I don't know that there's that much going on as far as oral communication, but is this a channel for, that could be helpful for us?
What a great question, right? We have all these things at our fingertips that we haven't quite figured out how we live them out. I will say for a lot of our newcomers, wherever they land, right? If somebody, and this would be for anyone on the move, right? The way they communicate now is fascinating, and they utilize all those things, right? You will see somebody who have their Google Translate phone out while they're having a conversation with someone. There are all of these pieces. And I do wonder, right, as a church, could we talk about that? And I will say one more thing about our churches as a Peace USA denomination is if you look at the churches that are being formed, so part of those 1001 communities, the largest group who's growing are immigrant congregations. So even in our midst of, as we understand ourselves as a church in the United States, right, and I think Michael's pushing us to think globally is important. I do. But just thinking about ourselves as a denomination in the United States, we're changing. And so what does that mean, right? And how do we think about utilizing these tools that are out there in meaningful ways? It's a great question.
And I'll just comment real quick and then I recognize Steve. I taught in a school, in a middle school in the eastern part of the county where I had a little over 100 kids from 44 different countries, 44. And the number of languages represented is mind-boggling. I had kids whose family had walked across Southeast Asia and were in the top classes in the county. And 2 years before, they'd gotten off a boat going off to Southeast Asia. The differences among their challenges for learning languages was amazing because they had difficulty, but they were able to get their thoughts apart. And one of we studied immigration in my class, and I did learn not to expect a lot of my kids as a community until at least the middle of the year, because at the beginning of the year, they were not tolerant of each other in lots of different ways, but they gained that tolerance and began to really form a strong community together. But when I started and I would talk about, okay, this is our, we do this in our country. And I learned to realize that they had different concepts of what our country was. But I would also remind us that, we think that this migration is new. But, I'm back in the 60s. I went to Italy with a friend whose parents had a shoe factory in New York and visited the village where most of the workers in her shoe factory, came from. Well, those people had come back and forth a bunch of times, even though at that point in time, people weren't flying much, to Europe. They were taking boats. So I think sometimes we feel like this is new, but, just like with Abraham, it's been going on a long time and the challenges are, great. Anyway, Steve, what's your question?
Amanda, I wanted to ask about the relationship between what your office does and the church's Matthew 25 initiative. Last week, about a half a dozen of us from this congregation went to the Mid-Atlantic Summit on Matthew 25 in Columbia, Maryland. Learned a lot about it and came away with an understanding of it, but not a deep understanding of it yet.
Thank you for the question. So my office is actually in the Office of the General Assembly. And so the Matthew 25 was an initiative of the Presbyterian Mission Agency, which are the two agencies that are in the process of unifying as we speak. And so because my office was in the Office of the General Assembly and really structured around the stated clerk, we weren't as involved in the Matthew 25 piece. However, my work I work with lots of colleagues in the mission agency because of the lens and the advocacy piece. So I work with a lot of colleagues who are in the Washington office. I work with a lot of colleagues who are at the United Nations. I work with a lot of colleagues who serve our church in global contexts as mission co-workers. And so and Presbyterian Disaster Assistance, who is also in the mission agency. So a lot of my work was adjacent to Matthew 25. And I think Matthew 25 has really been an initiative for the church to sort of come to think about mission in a cohesive way. I think it encompasses a lot of what churches do in their ministries, within their churches and outside of their churches and their communities. And I think it's just a way to come together to really think about how intersections of injustice happen. And what is our response to that as churches, and doing that in a sort of feeling like a more cohesive way. So I think Matthew 25 has been great to highlight certain issues and how do those issues connect in our country, and in our world. So I think it's a really great initiative for churches to feel a part of. I don't know what's going to happen with the unifying space and what's going to happen with Matthew 25. I think it will continue and hopefully be a place where people can come together. It might be named something different. I don't know what the stated clerk of the General Assembly will choose now that she's also the interim executive director. So I think there's going to be some changes for us, but it really has been that initiative where we can come together and see all what feels like can sometimes feel like disconnected ministries really come together in a very cohesive way to understand ourselves as Presbyterians in our living out our faith in community. So it has been a very important piece for those in the mission agency. Yeah.
My understanding of the Matthew 25 initiative is that it's an effort to get congregations to focus consciously on aligning their values with their missions. And certainly mission is advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm hoping that the process of unifying the mission agency and the General Assembly's related offices, that should be easier than 1983 and reunifying Southern denominations was.
Yeah.
We hope that's true. That's right. It should be. Yes. No, we're prayerful that it will be. Absolutely.
Yeah. But it sounds like what you're doing and what they're doing should just mesh very symbiotically.
Oh, I have a couple of comments in the chat. Diane Whitaker, who works with all the counties, the county libraries, says, I believe many people from Latin America don't want to learn English because they don't have the opportunity as adults and the spaces aren't available. For example, one service provider chose not to continue English literacy as their primary focus, but the focus on employment improvement. And public libraries here do offer some resources, but the local government's not able to support the need for staffing and materials that are needed. So,
Carol,
yes.
I wanted to say they do want to learn English.
Okay.
Not that they do not, they do. Yeah.
All right. So I'm sorry. Pardon, you're right. Totally. Sorry, excuse me. So they do want to learn English, but finding the time and the facilities and you know, in the past, folks have had the same struggle with learning English. I think we forget that in the 1800s, in the early 1900s, there were a lot of folks who never mastered English as adults, but their children did. So I don't know. I don't have the data for that for sure, but anyway, it's difficult. It's hard.
We've considered doing that in this, offering English as a second language in this congregation.
Yes.
Offering lessons. But it's just geographically not possible because the immigrant population doesn't live in Hiram, Bethesda.
Yeah, it's true.
But there are many congregations in Montgomery County that do offer it.
That's right.
Yeah, yes, there are. not enough, obviously, and,
Obviously.
you know. Yeah, and Nancy Silky just comments that in Broward County, Florida, election ballots are in 3 languages: English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole.
Real.
And yeah, and I think our ballots are
Bilingual.
bilingual, yeah, in a number of different
But
languages.
that said, pardon me for interrupting. I just got trained as an election judge for Tuesday.
Oh, okay.
Our ballots are bilingual, English and Spanish, but the county has available on call for anybody who needs it, interpreters for probably 50 or between 50 and 80 languages.
Yeah. Okay.
And we try to have one Spanish speaker at every polling place.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's great.
Amanda. John Gaffney, did you still have a comment you wanted to make? No? Oh.
Carol,
So,
we
John,
run out of comments. I have another one.
okay, just a second. John is saying that, if I get to his, he typed in a chat, comment in the chat. I'm sorry, gotta get down to it. My fingers aren't working very well here. I don't know, John, are you with us? You might want to just tell people, let me see. I'm having problems accessing this. Okay. Well, just a minute. I will try it again. Jack, go ahead and make your comment and I'll reach John.
Amanda, another barrier is that people come with different expectations of values. For example, if you come from a country where the government is not respected, you may be prone to not be involved in the government of your country, or to think that easily to believe the election was stolen, for example. So coming with different values makes it harder to find out what you have in common. And the same would be true of the church. People's view of what the church is for might be different if you were raised in a different country. So what should the church be doing? Should the church be a place of worship or a place of social activity, depending where you come from? You may have trouble finding enough values to move forward. Any thoughts about that?
Okay,
Gosh.
now.
Oh,
Yeah. Well, let's let Amanda respond to Jack, and then you can tell John.
what, I mean, these core values of who makes us what we are so key, right? And I will distinctly remember, and again, I told you that my in-laws are from Guatemala, and my mother-in-law has gone through the process of obtaining her citizenship. My father-in-law is still in the process. He's afraid of the test. He's really afraid of the naturalization test, which is another issue. But when she first got to vote in the United States, and she voted in Guatemala, it's a republic. It runs a little differently, but they are allowed to vote. But they will often say, right, there's very high distrust in the actual operating of political elections in Guatemala, and that's changing. But she said when she first got to vote in the U.S., she felt like she actually had a voice, and she now understood what it meant to have a civil duty to this place. And I think those values are really important. And not even people who reside in the country hold the same values, right? I think we're in a place too where we don't talk about those enough. And when you have newcomers in your community, I think it's an opportunity, Jack, to rethink, right? How do we even talk about it for those of us who have been here and sort of take some things for granted when we don't talk about it? So I think it offers us an opportunity to revisit all of that. I think that's true for church too. And we do bring different expectations. We bring different expectations for all of these ways in which we engage as people in these institutional spaces, right? And it is important to have those places where you can have those conversations in open ways. I think the dynamic of what happens at Bradley Hills probably opens you all up to that opportunity to talk about that a bit more because of the interfaith space. But I think those are such important conversations, not only for the populations who are new, but it's also populations who have been a part of these customs and traditions, and that we don't always think about them in important ways. So I think it opens up the opportunity to reestablish the way we understand ourselves, those values that we hold. I think it could be a really exciting place to do that work in ways that are meaningful to everyone. And so, but it may mean, right, if you open up that space, what change could be asked of someone. And I think that's always right. How do we come then, if we want to be a more uniform, unified community, what's going to be, how do we negotiate all of that, right? How do we come together? And we have history of that, right? It's not absolutely out of our more recent history in the United States, but how do we do that?
There are a number of comments in the chat, but we're getting close on time, and a number of people have thank you so much for this presentation. And then also Diane Whitaker had talked about people retaining speaking German in Pennsylvania, and yet, getting enough English to work in it for the workplace. John Gaffney's comment was about his wife who came from Italy and, had to learn English, and what the challenge that was and the uncomfortable feeling that was. And I just like to celebrate. I have sponsored a guy for 15 years and have seen all the detailed struggle that he had to go through. His wife isn't a citizen, but he needed a financial sponsor that I served. And Halloween night, I got a comment that he could come over to my house. And I thought, what is Claudio doing coming over to my house on Halloween with all the trick? And he was coming over because he just passed the citizenship test. And
Wow.
15 years of unbelievable detail. If I could just give you those details, it was unbelievable. But anyway, we have a lot of challenges. We still do. And I didn't ask you the question of how you were going to be lobbying Congress in the new Congress, whatever that would be. So I guess we'll just have to stay in touch with you, Amanda.
Yes, that would be great.
Because this is our office, and we can't thank you enough for the quality of the work that you are providing and some guidance, and please do. My email is carstar, CARSTARR @gmail.com. And Amanda, she is online if you were to get into the Presbyterian Church USA. That's how we found her. And we're so grateful to have you this morning. November is quite a month for us. And we're really focusing on trying to reach better understanding of our differences so that we can also find our commonalities. And next week, we will have with us Sahar Kamis, who is the associate professor in the Department of Communications at the University of Maryland, works with Andy Wolven.
I was her mentor when she first arrived.
And Andy was her mentor when she first arrived. Didn't hear that. She's a former Human Rights Commissioner in the Human Rights Commission in Montgomery County. She's president of the Arab USA Association for Communication Educators and chair of the Spiritual Communication Division at the National Communication Association. And her topic is countering Islamophobia, one fact at a time, the role of education and media literacy. We also, I wanted just to make sure that you know, on November 24th, Rabbi Eric Abbott will be speaking to us here in person to uncover the problems with anti-Semitism here and throughout the country, and leading us in ways that we can take action to become more understanding. And we will be celebrating on the 17th our interfaith community with a special service and luncheon. So following that, so plan on sticking with. We will not have a program on the 17th because of everything that will be going on in the church with our interfaith celebration. But stay with us, and I will also, one last thing, on Tuesday at noon, there will be a prayer service in our church in Covenant Hall. Both Rabbi Abbott and David will be leading us in prayer for that service. It will be streamed, and I think streamed through the BJC website, but I think that will be getting out to us through email, the contact. So anyway, thank you so much for being with us this morning, all of those at remotely and in person. And Amanda, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all. Blessings to you.
Thanks.
Quick comments. I have a